Hi, I'm Nina Mehta, co-director of PARCEO, along with Donna Neville, who is really one of the people that so many of us go to at this time for grounding and orientation for how to be a principled participant and partner in our work for Palestinian justice and more broadly in our interconnected movements for justice. We are so pleased to welcome everyone to this timely conversation on fighting anti-Semitism from a framework of collective liberation. Thank you to Haymarket Books, Jewish Voice for Peace, and Jewish Currents for co-sponsoring this talk with us. As Israel inflicts unfathomable violence in Gaza, the Palestinian people and communities across the globe are speaking up and taking action in powerful ways each and every day on campuses, in our schools, at our workplaces, in public spaces, in the streets, at the steps of and inside Congress. Protests, teach-ins, boycotts, civil disobedience, disrupting those supporting Israel's actions, making sure business does not go on as usual. We are also experiencing a rise in anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, and white nationalist violence. And we take very seriously the call to address and challenge that in our work and our organizing. And at the same time as we are witnessing anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence, we are also seeing Israel's supporters hurling false accusations of anti-Semitism and demonizing, targeting, and harming Palestinians and supporters of Palestinian justice. We are seeing a dangerous conflation of anti-Zionism and criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. Tactics are being used to silence opposition to and force attention away from genocide, from what's happening on the ground, on the land, in Palestine. These tactics are being pushed through House resolutions like 894, congressional hearings on university presidents, and ongoing efforts to criminalize and penalize those speaking out against Israel's ongoing violence. These tactics are intended to destroy our movements for justice and those who are part of them. And we know that our struggles against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, and anti-Black racism are intertwined. We are fully aware that there are campaigns to isolate and divide our struggles through task forces and resolutions and other means at federal, state, and institutional levels. In a recent statement and call that PARCEO and JVP joined, initiated by Muslims for Just Futures, we reiterate that we must be vigilant so that anti-hate and anti-violence work are not co-opted to further entrench the domestic violent extremism framework and expand the war on terror. The statement makes clear that we stand together against the multiple forms of violence and criminalization that many of our communities face in different ways. Today's conversation is connected to a popular education curriculum that PARCEO recently completed on anti-Semitism, which is rooted in a deep commitment to mutuality, solidarities, and joint struggle in our work to challenge anti-Semitism and all forms of injustice. In the curriculum, we look at what anti-Semitism is and how it shows up now, and we also look at it historically. In contrast to timelines like that offered by Senator Schumer from his recent address to Congress, timelines that characterize Jewish histories only in relation to anti-Semitism and as eternal and cyclical, we offer a perspective that reflects Jewish experience as including, but not limited to, anti-Semitism, and locates anti-Semitism in relation to local conditions and realities and other systems of oppression. And this impacts not only how we see anti-Semitism, but also how we think about responding to it. That is, distinct from or as part of and connected to other struggles against oppression. Learning from and with each other, as we are doing today, is integral to our organizing and building power together. It's part of the resistance that's happening across the globe. Resistance to genocide and the funding of genocide. Resistance to displacement, expulsion, and occupation. Resistance to tactics used to disrupt and criminalize our movements for justice. Resistance to anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all forms of racism, injustice, and oppression. Our resistance is a global call for justice and dignity, from all our rivers to all our seas. And I'd like now to introduce our thoughtful and brilliant panelists who we are so fortunate and appreciative to have here with us today. Beth Miller, Political Director of Jewish Voice for Peace Action, this political and advocacy sibling organization of Jewish Voice for Peace. In her role at JVP Action, Beth spearheads the organization's congressional advocacy and electoral organizing. She formerly served as the U.S. Advocacy Officer for Defense for Children International Palestine and the liaison to Jewish communities for the New York City Commission on Human Rights. And we have Barry Trachtenberg, who is the Rubin Presidential Chair of Jewish History at Wake Forest University. He's a historian of modern European and American Jewry and the author of 3 books, most recently The Holocaust and the Exile of Yiddish. He serves on many boards, and his writings on Zionism, anti-Semitism, and U.S. support for Israel have appeared in many forums, including Jewish Currents, one of the co-sponsors of today's event. And Niall Fort is a minister, activist, and scholar. He is currently an assistant professor of African American and African diaspora studies at Columbia University. Niall is also a faith-based organizer with the Dream Defenders. And I'd also like to add that we are thrilled that Niall is one of our community reviewers of PARCEO's curriculum on anti-Semitism from a framework of collective liberation, and that Barry generously shared his expertise with us throughout the process of developing the curriculum, particularly on our section on intersecting histories. So thank you all for being here. And I'd like to start now with Beth. Our first question. Could you please open up the discussion by speaking to the current political landscape, such as recent resolutions, bills, speeches, and what challenges this presents for our work?
Thanks so much, Nina, and for organizing this panel. And Niall and Barry, it's such an honor to be in this conversation with all of you today. Yeah, I'm happy to kick us off by talking about a pretty bleak situation that we are in, which is how our US government is currently responding to this moment, and I will say, making us all less safe, and what actions they are doing that is leading us in that direction. The big picture here, just to kind of zoom out so that we don't lose track of what really is happening at the core right now, is that we are in the context of 75 years of Israeli apartheid rule over Palestinians. We are in the wake of the horrific attacks of October 7th, and we are now in the midst of what is very clearly an unfolding genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. Amidst that, as we see this death toll of Palestinians rise literally by the minute, carried out by a government that we are actively funding and supporting and shielding from accountability, and whose atrocities are being essentially live streamed to the world, we're seeing accordingly a rise in protest against it in this country, across college campuses, just in streets across cities and towns across the US, in progressive Democrats breaking off from traditional wisdom of what is okay to say in DC. In all sorts of ways, we are seeing protest to this genocide, to what is happening, and to US complicity in it. Because of all that, our government, the US government, and specifically bad faith actors in our US government, are taking advantage of this moment to try to limit our ability to protest, silence our ability to protest, and in order to ensure ongoing support for Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. Whenever there is this kind of level of war and atrocity going on, especially when our own government is involved, it's very common for us to also see a rise in hate here in the US. We know that this is how it goes, right? We've seen this time and time again. So while this is all happening, we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism. We're seeing a rise in anti-Palestinian violent hatred. We're seeing anti-Muslim hatred and racism. We're seeing anti-Arab hatred and racism. It's all on the rise right now. And members of the US Congress are taking advantage of that to push forward their own political agendas. And it's making all of us in danger. We are all trying to stay focused on trying to figure out, how do we keep ourselves safe? How do all of our communities keep ourselves safe? How do we move forward toward a future where there can be liberation and justice for all people, and all people can be living in freedom and safety? And Congress and the Biden administration are actively getting in the way of that. And they are actively trying to disrupt that work. The GOP in particular, I think it's important to say, has kind of figured out a way to repeatedly play political games and try to distract from what is going on in Gaza by centering the conversation almost entirely around false conflations between criticisms of the Israeli government and the Israeli state with anti-Semitism. And so that's looked like a few different things. You mentioned a few of them, Nina, when you kind of brought us into this question. But just to say, for folks who are blessedly not following really closely what's going on in DC, there is really not a day that goes by where this isn't coming up. And for the last 3 weeks at least, there has been a vote every single week conflating these things. Really, it's more than the last 3 weeks. It goes beyond that as well. This has been constant over the last 2 months, but even before that, but it has kicked up deeply over the last 2 months. So for example, today, right now, there will be a likely vote in the House on a resolution put forward by Congresswoman Stefanik, who, it is worth noting that despite the fact that she went viral for a pretty absurd line of questioning of university presidents around what she said was anti-Semitism, but really was about questioning them around activism on campuses. She's pushing forward a resolution to condemn them and call for their resignation. Last week, there was a resolution conflating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. The week before that, there was a resolution about how you can't talk about Israel's right to exist, or whether or not that is a legitimate right to exist without it being anti-Semitic. These things go on and on and on. There's also, of course, the hearing I just mentioned, where there was a congressional committee hearing where they spent 5 hours grilling university presidents about Palestinian rights activism on their campuses and falsely claiming that activism was all about attacking Jews. That is now spiraling out into resignations of presidents and ongoing pressures there. And we also saw, for example, Chuck Schumer, the highest ranking Jewish official in the United States, give a 40-minute long speech on the Senate floor, where while he started the speech by saying, "I'm not doing this to say that criticisms of the Israeli government are anti-Semitic," he then went on to give a speech that basically said criticisms of the Israeli government are anti-Semitic. And he gave a speech that pushed forward this incredibly dangerous, flawed idea that, and I'm quoting here, that Jews are alone, that anti-Semitism is cyclical, it is never ending, and ultimately we are alone. He also gave a speech that completely erased the fact that within Jewish communities here in the United States, there is dissent. There is anti-Zionism. There are Jewish communities that do not support the Israeli state, that do not support the Israeli government. We also hear from the Biden administration this constant, dangerous rhetoric about how if there were no Israel, Jews everywhere would not be safe. Horrifying rhetoric, really, to hear from the president of the United States. All of these things, these resolutions, these hearings, these speeches, this language coming out of the highest ranking folks in our government, what it is doing is actively endangering Jewish communities, and it is actively endangering Palestinian communities and excusing and fueling the ongoing genocide against Palestinians. Because to be clear, there is rising anti-Semitism in this country, and it's scary. And there is rising anti-Palestinian racism in this country, and it is scary. And what Congress is doing is fueling both of them at the exact same time. When a Jewish person is blamed for what the Israeli government does for no other reason than their Jewish identity, that is anti-Semitic. And when Congress goes out of its way to say that there is no difference between Judaism and Zionism, that is anti-Semitic. And they are actively working to tie the fates of the entire Jewish diaspora to the war crimes of the Israeli government. And that endangers us. And they're putting Palestinians in a position of needing to choose between talking about their lived experiences and life and dispossession by the Israeli government, or being smeared falsely as anti-Semitic. And they are fueling violence like the shooting of 3 Palestinian students in Vermont, the murder of a Palestinian child in Chicago. So all that to say, in addition to what I think is quite obvious to all of us because we've dealt with it for so long, which is that these initiatives actively undermine and quell our right to free speech, our right to activism, our right to criticize the actions of a government, be it ours or another. These actions, I think it's really important that we note, actively worsen the situation for Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, and Jews here in the United States. We are all less safe because of Congress's attempts to do these things. And they are doing it while simultaneously platforming real anti-Semitism. Chuck Schumer, while he spent 40 minutes on the House floor talking about conflations between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, had just been on a stage with Pastor John Hagee a few weeks before, a man who thinks that Jewish people should control the Holy Land so that the second coming will happen and we will go to hell. I think that what I'll wrap on this and just say is that I think that we should all be deeply, deeply alarmed by the direction this is going in and how quickly it is spiraling out of control, and how the actions of this Congress and the Biden administration right now are making all of our communities deeply unsafe and are actively fueling and enabling the ongoing genocide of Palestinians.
Thank you so much, Beth. That is really clarifying and helps to know what we're up against, the war machine, repression tactics, and how to stand up to those challenges and how to keep us safe, all of us safe. Thank you. Barry, I'd like to turn to you next. Elaborating upon this landscape that Beth just described, can you offer us some framing around the historical context of understanding anti-Semitism in contrast to hearings and speeches like Senator Schumer's that silence other forms of violence, such as Islamophobia, and the certain notions of eternal Jewish suffering, which Beth touched upon, and I did as well, but we'd like to hear more from you, please.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. I'd also like to add my thanks to the organizers for this conversation. I'd like to start by, though, admitting my discomfort in talking about anti-Semitism in this moment. I am wary, as I think many of you may be as well, about adding to this conversation that's being raised by Congress, the White House, American Jewish organizations, as well as the mainstream media, as a diversionary strategy to take our focus off of the key issue that is in front of us, which is the ongoing genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. We have some 1.9 million people who are forcibly displaced, over 18,000 murdered, nearly half of them children. There's no value at all given to Palestinian life by our elected representatives. This genocide is being funded by the United States with US supplied weapons. And so as Biden, Schumer, and Stefanik are once again raising the specter of anti-Semitism, which I think we should acknowledge in many instances is the discomfort of American Jews having their political allegiances questioned. While we're having this conversation, they're funding the mass murder of an entire people. So I just want to start with that so that we keep our focus where it really, really needs to be in this moment. That is not to say that anti-Semitism is not real, as Nina and Beth have said very clearly. It is. The instances of anti-Semitism are growing. It is dangerous. And we also have to understand this increase is happening alongside what clearly seems to be based on reporting a much larger increase in Islamophobia in the country. And as I'll talk about, as I suspect others will as well, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are intertwined with one another and often escalating on account of the current crisis. So unlike what Schumer and most major Jewish organizations will insist, Anti-Semitism is not the world's longest hatred. It is not unique, it is not exceptional, and it does not stand alone in history or in the current day. This notion of Jews that we hold as an eternally suffering people has its roots in the Jewish past, certainly, but it's also very much a product of the late 19th century anti-Jewish violence in Europe, and then in Zionist mythology, history, and memorials, which have elevated this aspect of Judaism and Jewish culture above all others. And it's being done so in order to justify this ongoing project of eradicating non-Jews from the land, which began long before 1948 and continues while we're speaking here. This logic, though, of an eternal anti-Semitism or as a cyclical anti-Semitism that is somehow inescapable, it leads those who advocate it to an endless justification of identifying anyone who's an opponent of the project of Zionism as an enemy of the Jewish people, treats all enemies of Israel or opponents of Israel as Nazis. And if you categorize them in this way, if you categorize us in this way, it means that they are able to enact any form of violence upon us. And the most damaging component of this idea of eternal Jewish suffering, it seems to me, is that it absolves us, and here I'm speaking as an American Jew, of any sort of communal Jewish accountability through our major organizations, our lobby groups, our synagogues, and of course with Israel. Because since we imagine ourselves as history's victims, we ignore our own capacities to be perpetrators of violence, even in spite of this insurmountable evidence that we are seeing across our screens, every moment. So, as I'll discuss, this understanding of the Jewish past rips Jews out of our own history, and it reinforces notions of fundamental Jewish difference. So, some of what I'll try to unpack in the time that I have here is a little bit of this history of anti-Semitism, going back a bit and bringing it to the current. And I'll do this pretty quickly. Sometimes I do this over a whole semester, so I'll try, I'll be skipping over quite a bit. Of course, there was forms of anti-Jewish hatred in pre-modern Europe. Jews were one of the only tolerated non-Christian religious minorities within Europe. They were permitted to exist in most European societies throughout the Middle Ages. They were also accused of being Christ killers and regularly accused of trying to undermine Christianity. And in spite of this hostility, and in some ways because of this hostility, they were also part of the social, religious, and economic fabric of European life. Jews were widely held as suspect in comparison to non-Jews because they tended to keep themselves apart from Christians, but also tended to be much better off in many instances, educationally, economically, in terms of social structures, than the vast majority of medieval Europeans who tended to be peasants and were bound to the land. I'm talking in the Middle Ages, obviously. Jews were not permitted to be peasants. They were not permitted to work the land, and so were forced to adopt positions and to shape their societies in many ways as more urbanized ones, favoring villages over farms, towns over villages, cities over towns, and took on roles that were only permitted to them and often banned to Christians, such as engaging in money lending or tax collecting or lots of forms of trade and barter. And so Jews often existed as strangers in the midst, but with whom there were regular and often codified points of contact. Jews tended not to have their own political leaders or military forces. And this special situation that Jews found themselves in forced them to adopt a politics of self-preservation, which required them having to navigate and negotiate their legal and social positions between otherwise hostile or antagonistic forces. So that means they were often positioned between the state and subjects, between landowners and tenants, between the church and worshipers. And what this means is that Jews often experience periods of great hostility, but also, and what gets ignored, periods of great prosperity, both of which sometimes we tend to overinflate in terms of importance. And so Jews existed in many ways as an other to European Christians, as a way to identify themselves against. However, we should note that if Jews were in the internal other within Europe to Christianity, they also existed in relation to an external other, that of Muslims, who, with the exception of the Iberian Peninsula, were not permitted to inhabit Europe, to reside in Europe throughout much of the Middle Ages. And certainly other people know this history far more than I do. But just as the image of the Jew who is present within Europe existed as a figure against which Christianity defined itself, the image of the absent Muslim loomed just as large. Right? We know this from Edward Said's Orientalism or his work Culture and Imperialism and others. Also at times, though, in the Christian imagination, Jews and Muslims are blurred with one another. They are cast as Orientals who exist as religious and spiritual competitors to Christianity. One group Jews challenging Christianity's origins, and the other Islam challenging its legacy. And both become archetypal strangers in the European imaginary. Now, in the modern period, by which I mean, as a historian, the late 19th century or so, we see the beginnings of what we begin to call modern anti-Semitism. What divides or what separates earlier forms of anti-Jewish hatred between these modern forms of anti-Semitism is that these modern forms have a secular basis to them. And as Europe and the Western world is reorganizing itself, I only have 2 minutes. All right, I'm going to do my best. As these groups are trying to reorganize, as these societies are reorganizing themselves, what we see over and over again is that Jews are not allowed to fit into the pre-existing categories of race, which is increasingly biological, categories of nation, of gender, of class. What unites all of these concerns about Jews is this idea that Jews are utterly and fundamentally incommensurate with the societies of which they're a part, and that they simultaneously seek to undermine the standing order. This, of course, leads to texts such as the Protocols, the Elders of Zion, the Dreyfus Affair, leads to pogroms in Russia, and of course, massive spikes in anti-Jewish violence. But it was also intertwined with other forces in Europe, new genocidal forces of imperialism in the US, post-Reconstruction racial violence that inflicted Black codes and racial violence here in this country. And the last point that I'll make is after 1948 and in the decades following, we began to see calls or concerns that there's a new anti-Semitism. And this brings us to this new period that we now find ourselves in, which is this instrumentalization of anti-Semitism, which is so mixed up with actual anti-Semitism that it's actually really quite hard, I think, to disentangle the two. So while to Zionists and their supporters, the new anti-Semitism is about calling out criticism of Israel as inherently anti-Semitic, what this new anti-Semitism actually is a manifestation of collective Jewish power that is organized to thwart any criticism of the state of Israel, through groups such as AIPAC, the ADL, the American Jewish Congress, and major Jewish denominations. So now we find ourselves, this is my last point, in this moment where the old anti-Semitism, that of attacks against Jews for their seemingly fundamental difference to all others, has become intertwined with this new anti-Semitism. And this is the task before us, I think, to try to disentangle these two, to acknowledge that anti-Semitism exists as a real threat in this world, but also to not allow it to be used in order to facilitate and lay the foundations for the ongoing genocide of Palestinians. Thank you.
Barry, thank you so much. That was so interesting. And we, of course, totally agree that centering anti-Semitism is a diversionary tactic. And we hope together we are pushing against that. But you really do help to orient us and take us out of a narrow eternalist view of anti-Semitism and further towards a contextual understanding of history, identity, and accountability. So thank you so much for that. And Niall, next, I'd like to ask you if you could please talk about why and how challenging anti-Semitism from a framework of collective liberation is so critical, particularly at this moment, and how you understand challenging anti-Semitism as connected to challenging Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, and all forms of injustice.
Thank you. First, I want to thank PARCEO thank Haymarket, Jewish Currents, all the co-sponsoring organizations. Thank you so much to Beth for that really sharp political analysis. Thank you so much, Barry, for that really rich historical context. A lot of love also to PARCEO for this wonderful curriculum. More will be shared about it at the end, but just want to right now shout out as someone who had the wonderful opportunity to contribute, and not just contribute, but to learn from this curriculum. I really, really encourage you all to dig deeper and just see this conversation as a beginning, but not as an end, to learning more, to struggling harder. And so a lot of love to everyone who made the curriculum possible. And the last thing I'll say is please forgive me. I have my screen on blur, but you might see boxes behind me. And that is because I'm in the middle of a move. And as Barry is also fighting the flu, my partner and her 2 children are fighting the flu. So I'm going to need you all to have a lot of grace and generosity with me. I'll do my best, but I'm just happy to be here with you all. So I want to talk very briefly about my introduction to this conversation, and then I would like to talk a bit about this tradition of internationalism, particularly Black internationalism. And then I want to end with this question of identity politics or a politics of solidarity. And so 2014, many of you may know, my students don't know. I had to be like, wow, they don't all know about Michael Brown. And it's like showing my age, I guess. These are 19 and 20 years old. They might have sort of heard of them, but I'm sure many of you on this call heard about Michael Brown. And so I was one of those young Black people who ended up hopping on a bus from New York City. It was 41 of us to Ferguson, Missouri, in the aftermath of Michael Brown's police killing by white police officer Daniel Pontaleo. Of course, this was a string of police killings. Many of us were angry. Many of us were trying to figure out this question of police violence. And like some other folks who were on the streets, I was actually tear gassed by the police while trying to protest police violence. And it was through that struggle that I was actually introduced to the movement for justice in Palestine. One of the co-founders of the Dream Defenders, Ahmed Abusned, who is a Palestinian, actually invited me onto a delegation to Palestine in 2017. And I can talk a lot about that experience. But what I'm really framing, or why I'm starting here, is because I want to point out that I went to Ferguson because of anti-Black racism. I went to Ferguson because I kept seeing Black people being killed by police. Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Michael Brown. And then from there, we can name so many names. But I didn't end my struggle in Ferguson. Actually, my struggle around anti-Black racism led me to Palestine. And that's important for me because my own personal journey, I think, is a testament to the importance of this conversation and the importance of this curriculum, which is to say that although a particular issue or a particular form of injustice mobilized me to fight against it, it was actually my entrance and not my end into the broader struggle. And I want to shout out for people who have a particular issue that mobilized you. Many of us can think back around our own politicization to say, you know, this particular instance. But the question is, where do we then go from there once we are a part of that movement? And so from there, I began to learn not just about the struggle or movement for justice in Palestine, but I began to learn about a host of different movements against all forms of oppression. When I went to Ferguson, I didn't know anything about environmental justice. I thought that was a white people thing. You know, Black people, we had too much on our plate. Cops are killing about 3 people a day, disproportionately Black. Over 2 million people in our prison systems, including someone like my nephew who was sentenced to 10 years in prison at 25 years old, disproportionately Black. We can talk about, you know, racial capitalism and talking about unemployment and joblessness. It felt like it was a lot already on our plate. And so for me, going to Palestine was more than just being introduced to this movement. It was about being introduced and committed then to a global fight for justice across all forms of oppression. including, of course, environmental racism. I didn't know that a lot of African American families, about 35%, live near a coal plant, for example. I hadn't learned or heard about racial capitalism and the connections and entanglements between issues of race and this history of capitalist exploitation. The fact that 1 in every 3 Black children, for example, are growing up poor in the richest nation on earth. Queer antagonism, thinking more broadly about who are victims of police violence, many of whom have queer identities, some of whom are disabled or differently abled. And so just thinking more expansively about our own struggles for justice really happened for me because of my own connection with Palestine. So this was the beginning of my awareness of this broader internationalist tradition, which I think the Black radical tradition, the Black prophetic tradition. I come out of the Black church with all of its flaws and contradictions. One of the things that it does offer us is this idea that Black people have stood in solidarity with all oppressed people across the world and in solidarity with all those who are fighting forms of oppression across the world. And there's so many beautiful examples of this. You can think about when Italy invaded Ethiopia. You had folks in Harlem, including Ella Baker, who stood up against the invasion against the Ethiopian people. We can think about when the British Crown, were subduing the sub-Indian continent. You had Black artists and intellectuals like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois who were fighting against that form of colonialism. We can think of course, about South Africa. We can think about so many issues, even in contemporary. Black Lives Matter activists going to Brazil to stand in solidarity with the landless farmers movement, or being swept into the indigenous struggle against Standing Rock and forms of injustice around, lead and flint and water. So there's this sort of broader tradition that I was introduced to, again, through this very particular issue that mobilized me beyond that. And I just want to make 2 points that come to mind when I think about anti-Semitism from a framework of collective liberation. One is around identity and the other is around solidarity. So it seems to me that we have a choice between either a narrow politics of identity or an expansive politics of solidarity. And a narrow identity politics essentially says that identity determines and discloses everything we know about our ideas, our values, and our experiences. And this is a really dangerous form of thinking about and practicing identity that oftentimes leads to a dangerous deference. And so since October 7th, I've received all kinds of interesting emails and communication from folks. And one of the stories is, hey, as Jewish people, we were there for you during the civil rights movement, and we were there for you in Ferguson and during the movement for Black lives. And there's a lot to be said about that narrative of who's the we, thinking about communities in much more complex, diversified ways. But the point I'm trying to make is that kind of statement is rooted in an identity politics, a narrow identity politics, which is to say, because I hold this identity, you should listen to me. And that's a very dangerous form of thinking about how to fight for justice. And I want us to think about a different way of fighting for justice, which is really around a politics of solidarity, a big we. And I think of the Combahee River Collective, that feminist, socialist, Black, lesbian group who connected their fight against racism and against patriarchy to the fight against to imperialism and a commitment to socialism. So you have these lesbian Black women rooted in this tradition of fighting against the forms of oppression that are directly aimed against them. But they also say that we are going to form solidarity with Black men who are struggling against patriarchy and against white women who are struggling against racism. I think the Combahee River Collective is a remarkable example, for at least for me, to think about how to fight anti-Semitism from a framework of collective liberation that understands, as Black feminists like Patricia Hill Collins have talked about for a long time, this idea of a matrix of domination or interlocking oppressions. It's now been picked up as an idea of intersectionality, But what that says is, of course, that we also hold multiple identities. There's no singular identity that a human being holds. So even when we say that story of, well, we were there for you, well, what about Black Jewish people? And I say the same thing to Black people who say, well, we got a lot on our plate. Why are we fighting for Palestinians? I say, well, what about Black Palestinians? You know, they're there, a small but rich community of people. So this kind of feminist tradition makes us think about our intersecting identities that are always at play, and then what it requires for us, if we're ever going to achieve liberation, is to pay attention to those multiple identities, understand how they are intersecting, and build a solidarity around them. The last thing I guess I'll say is that, how do we practice solidarity? So if we understand that there are intersecting oppressions, if we understand that we have multiple identities, what then does it look like for us to form solidarity? And I think, of course, political solidarity is extremely important. We can make many connections between, for example, Black people and Palestinian people, or especially historically, Jewish people and Black people, just to name a few. But I think of people like Robin D.G. Kelly, who've really taught me about a much more beautiful way of thinking about solidarity that's not reducible to our politics of sameness, that we have to be mass incarcerated the same. We have to have the same kind of statistics around police violence. We have to be situated within a racial capitalist structure in a similar way. What if we practice solidarity in a way that's rooted in a moral commitment to the preciousness of all human life? That for the fact that you're born, and for the fact that you're here, and for the fact that you have breath in your body, and that we share that same air, not just as human beings, but the entire planet, that you're worth fighting for. That to me is the most beautiful, the most rich, and the most liberating form of solidarity. And again, this curriculum and this conversation to me is one chapter of that broader story of what solidarity looks like collectively.
Wow, Niall, thank you so much. Your story about how you were brought into an internationalist perspective oriented towards our global collective struggle is so inspiring and so right, and yes, so expansive, and helps bring us to a solidarity praxis. So thank you so much for that. And really thank you all of our speakers for your insights and thoughtfulness. We have one final question that I'd like to ask you all before we end today. We have 15 minutes left, so you can take up to 3 minutes to respond. And feel free in your response to also respond to one another if that feels right. But the question is, with so much going on, what do you think is most important for us to consider as we move forward and continue to build strong movements for justice? And you know what? We'll start with Beth again. And again, feel free to both respond to the others, but also focus on that question, please. And we'll go Beth, Barry, Niall again.
I feel like my answer to this question kept changing as I was listening to Barry and Niall. This was it was so amazing to hear you both share all your thoughts. And now I'm kind of like, it's all the most important thing we have to consider. Everybody just take the whole panel, and that's it feels like overwhelming to try to think about what's the most important thing to consider. I think the thing though that I feel like keeps coming up over and over and over again for me is, when we think about what Barry led with, not being distracted from the most urgent thing we are dealing with right now, which is an unfolding genocide before our eyes that our government is supporting and arming and defending, but also then thinking about, Niall, what you said about the reason to show up for one another is that all human life is precious and that we have to be showing up for every single human life. I think that, and then from my perspective, where I'm kind of oriented toward the nastiness of Capitol Hill, I think that the core thing to me seems to be to keep in mind the ways that we can prevent and resist the overwhelming forces at play that are trying to pit us against one another. Because we all have in our communities in different ways, and I'll speak as an American Jewish person, my community, the institutions that claim to represent my community have so much blame in what is going on. There's so much that we need to be held accountable for how institutions in the Jewish community have led and moved. And then also there's Jews who have been trying to resist and fight against this for decades. That there's all these communities that are not monoliths, that no one community is just a victim or just the oppressor, that, like Nyla, you said, we all hold all these identities, but there are people who are profiteering from this war right now, right? Like, so many of us are in grief for so many different reasons. And then there are people who are not. And there are systems that are not. There are systems that are just thrilled this is happening because this is what they want. They want their stocks to skyrocket. They want an apocalyptic war in the Middle East. There are people who are like, oh, this is what I wanted. And the rest of us need to recognize and realize that we can't let them take hold of the narrative and pit us against one another, because at the end of the day, it's hard to say it without sounding cliche, but it's cliche for a reason. At the end of the day, we are not going to be safe if we are not all safe, and we are the only ones that will keep one another safe. It won't be Congress, won't be the Biden administration, won't be the Israeli government. We have to do this for ourselves, and that means we have to pull as hard as we can against this intention to try to say, like, okay, well, if you want to be safe, it means you have to oppress all these people or any other version of that. Easier said than done, obviously, but I think that that's something that needs to be a guiding light for all of us moving forward.
But should I chime in now?
Yes, please. That'd be great.
Okay. So yes to all of that and everything said by Beth and Niall before. I'll just add a couple quick pieces. One is that I found in my university, where I work, that there's enormous hesitation by people who are quite sympathetic towards the position of Palestinians to speaking up too loudly, for fear of misstepping, for fear of falling into these various rhetorical traps that are being set, as we saw in that congressional hearing with the university presidents, for fear of being called out and professionally and having to suffer the consequences. That fear that we feel, and sometimes I feel it too, is a consequence, we should say, of a very deliberate strategy that has been going on for decades to intimidate us into not speaking our truths, into not speaking from fact-based evidence, from not pointing out to the obvious contradictions that are present within the rhetoric and the strategies of our oppressors. And I think we have to sort of reach down as deep as we can and really, draw from our convictions and take those risks just to speak out on behalf of Palestinian lives in this moment. And we have to be the models of the ways to speak about this without falling into anti-Semitism, without falling into those rhetorical traps that are being laid for us. So I guess what I would say is that for moving forward, one of the things that we need are the rhetorical tools that will allow us to push back against this onslaught on the truth, this onslaught on human lives that is occurring at this moment. And it really means taking those risks. But I think when we take those risks, what we realize is that there are many people who are going to be receptive to this message, who will appreciate what you're saying, and that will give you strength to carry forward.
You would think that. I mean, it's so embarrassing by this point to do, it's just like after a year of the pandemic, it was still okay, but now it's just ridiculous. I said that everything Beth and Barry said is extremely important. Engage the curriculum. I highly, highly encourage you to continue this conversation and to do it not just in the singular experience of your living room, but to take it widely to your communities. I've learned so much from it. I'm continuing to learn from it, and it has a beautiful way of building community across difference. And I think that's extremely important. So one, I would say engage the curriculum after this conversation. Two, I would say that this conversation has helped me think about what's important. Barry, your deep historical context in conversation with Beth, your really sharp political clarity in conversation with my offering of a kind of moral commitment. And of course, they go hand in hand, understanding not just anti-Semitism historically, but all forms of oppression, because we can slip into a kind of eternal idea of anti-Black racism, for example, which does exist, or an internal idea of patriarchy, and all forms of oppression have this kind of temptation of thinking about it outside of history, outside of political economy. And so that historical context is important. Being very clear about what's happening politically, I think, is also really, really important. I thought this was a religious conflict growing up as a kid in the church, and then realized that this is not a conflict of religion. This is about land. It's about power. It's about domination, about control, about capital. And then, of course, not stopping there, but even in our questions around history, even in our struggle to get political clarity, at the end of the day, doing what my mom told me, which is always try to do what's right. Always try to do what's right. And I think that's really important. And lastly, just be real concrete about joining this movement, wherever you are, whoever you are, whether you're teaching middle schoolers, whether you are a lawyer thinking about how to fight for human rights law, whether you are a clergy member trying to figure out what to tell your congregation, whether you are a journalist trying to push back against this establishment that's making it difficult to write any stories about this in a complex or in a clear way. I just highly encourage us to join organizations, keep signing those letters, keep calling Congress, keep calling for a ceasefire, because we're in this for the long haul.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, really, Beth, Barry, Niall. Thank you so much. Your perspectives, your analyses, your actions, your rhetorical tools are just so insightful and critical right now. Thanks so much. And thank you again to JVP, Jewish Currents, and Haymarket for co-sponsoring this program with PARCEO, and to Haymarket for hosting us in the wonderful way you always do, and to Donna Neville, who is also so fully here with us behind the scenes. Appreciate everything you do. And just to mention, since we are here, we've been here for this hour with our panelists. We have not engaged in the chat, but please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions. We really look forward to many more conversations. And as Niall mentioned, and again, so grateful for all of for the feedback and the engagement with the curriculum. Please do go to our curriculum website for more information. It's antisemitismcurriculum.org. And if you have a group that is interested, we facilitate workshops in schools and communities and would be happy to be in touch with you. It is not available online, but it is it is available to be facilitated. And we really do look forward to continuing to build and learn, resist, and organize together with you, with all of you. Thank you.